be here. It's a privilege, and on behalf of the hospital, indeed all our midwives, some of whom are here today, to be asked and join in this first global conference, Doctoral Midwifery Research Society, and we would want to support, and hopefully we can develop some partnerships that will develop in the future and to everybody's benefit. And I think this is the benefit of conferences like this. I was just thinking about, Mavis saying about not keeping you from your coffee. Unfortunately, it's going to be me that's going to keep you from your coffee, but there is a lot to do, and I'll try and go through it as quickly as possible, but certainly I've got my email address there, and if anybody is interested in asking questions either today or at some later stage, please do so. I apologise I wasn't here last night, and I apologise I won't be here this evening, because I think the importance of conferences like this is to interact and get ideas from everybody else. Now, I was asked to talk about active management of labour and in relation to evidence. And I chose this title, and indeed I changed the title a little bit from the original one in the programme. But what I'm really trying to say is active management of labour, the questions I want you to ask is, do we all know what it is? Are we talking about the same thing? And I would actually say there's about 2 or 3 people in the world that think they know what it is. And I'm not quite sure whether I include myself. And I also want to talk about evidence-based medicine and drift a little bit there, maybe being a little bit controversial, but do we actually know what that means, really? And or at the end of the day, is it, as I put it, and I'll come back to this, just personal opinion based on fact? And I think that's very important to establish, because I think it's the basis of all what we do and how we try and improve it. And certainly in a meeting like this, where we're trying to base what we do, indeed all of us try and do it on the best information, evidence available, then it's important. This is the National Maternity Hospital, and these 2 things are to reflect what we believe is important about active management of labour. Above everything else, what people read, what people remember, one-to-one care. And that doesn't just necessarily mean to one midwife in the same room as a woman, but actually what are they doing, not with their back towards them, but looking after them. And that is that. And that image I want you to remember, because everything else we do, despite misunderstandings, misinterpretation, is based on trying to provide that. And this is our clinical report, something which we're very proud of, something which develops from year to year, but that is what we believe, the evidence, and we record everything in there, and it's there for people to see, and for us to see and reflect, to make sure that we provide the best care possible. Just a little bit about the National Maternity Hospital. Tertiary referral unit, 9,300 mothers delivered last year. It's probably going to be more than that this year. 9,600 is a busy place. 68% normal delivery rate, 13% vaginal operative delivery rate, 19% caesarean section rate, particularly low in spontaneous labour, and a perinatal mortality rate of 4 to 6 per thousand, depending on what definition you use. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the concept and the name, which we must admit is used and mentioned and talked about so much, I think more by people who work outside the hospital rather than people that work inside the hospital. Evidence-based medicine, and a little bit about the future, because I think it's important in a conference like this to say, where are we going to go? Where do we want to go? And look towards goals. It'd be remiss to start without talking about one of my predecessors, Kieran O'Driscoll, again a name which is synonymous with active management of labour, and quoted, and we'll come back to that in a minute, in the most unusual of places by people who would have many different opinions in many ways to the idea of active management of labour or how they interpret it, but he did make some important statements and reflections on labour. But the concept was, and this is 1963, an ongoing active involvement, supervision of labour at every stage with its primary objective, the improvement of the quality of care extended to all women in labour. And this is written in his clinical report and also in the initial paper. There's nothing, that's what we all want to do. There's nothing very mysterious about that. And indeed, a lot of the issues in active management of labour, there's nothing very special about all of them. It's the putting it together. But I do want to distinguish between active management of labour with capital letters, a concept, a myth, a thing in the air, as opposed to actively managing labour, which is where people confuse things, inducing people, rupturing membranes, putting a drip up, and even now in very current publications, and I won't necessarily name them, but there is still a misunderstanding, and it confuses this with induction, which is the very opposite to what we stand for. But most importantly, the whole business of active management of labour, and it wasn't even called active management of labour then, began with a paper in 1969, where the philosophy was, and the big issue at the time was prevention of prolonged labour, a curtailment of duration of exposure to stress. Stress as opposed to pain. Stress, we look at pain and we try and treat that with different analgesics, things like that, but it's the stress that's the most important thing. And the management of pain is a different issue altogether. With the avoidance of the physical and emotional trauma. We concentrate so much on physical, but the emotional trauma, which is likely to follow prolonged labour. And indeed, it was a male obstetrician, O'Driscoll, in the early 60s, that commented at the time, although childbirth has long ceased to present a serious physical challenge to healthy women in Western society, the emotional impact of labour remains matter of common concern. And is this a problem still today? I don't know what you feel. We feel generally that we can contribute much more to the emotional well-being of the woman rather than the physical well-being of the woman. This is just something I picked from the internet. It's very easy nowadays. It's 2009, Sky News Online. We all listen to Sky, well, a lot of us do anyway. 1 in 3 mothers is left alone during or just after labour because maternity service is overstretched. More than a third, 35% questioned by the RCM and parenting website NetMums, said they'd been abandoned during or after labour at a time when they felt worried. And it goes on, and I think this will continue. We've got to recognise it. Now, recognising it is the first thing. The solutions we need to discuss, learn from each other, and look at ways we can do that. Another one, September 2009, Journal of Psychosomatic... I didn't even know there was a Journal of Psychosomatic Obstetrics and Gynecology. But again, conclusions, as negative birth experience, in our view at least, related as just as often to prolonged labour as much to anything else, predicts the wish for caesarean section. Specific supportive care during first pregnancy could play a pivotal role in making this decision. Now remember, NULIPs, first-time mothers choose or request a caesarean section because of something they're worried that might happen. Second-time mothers request a caesarean section because of something that did happen. We have to recognise that. We have to learn from each other and come to conclusions. Now, back to active management of labour, and I think there are some important, precise points, and I'll bring them up. I won't avoid any, and certainly I'll answer any questions. But the key message is efficient uterine action, and that's the key to normality. And why we would agree with it, I suppose, where we differ maybe, some people differ in how we achieve that. But certainly, and going through these principles very quickly, a clear distinction is made in the concept of active management of labour between NULIPs and MULTIPs, so much so that we use different coloured partograms. I'm sure most of you realise that, and it seems crazy, but it's actually just to focus the point. And a lot of these things are very basic things, but I suppose it's the emphasis that we put on it. That NULIPs and MULTIPs are very different. You only have to ask the student midwife, who would she take? The MULTIP that came in at 2 centimetres in spontaneous labour, or the NULIP that's 9 centimetres and going to deliver shortly, who's after induction. It doesn't take the medical student or student midwife long. And these are the things that are important. So everything we do is related to that. The difference between spontaneous and induced labour, a fundamental concept. Yet how often is it, and certainly some units I've worked at, you ask them whether they're in labour or whether they're not in labour. Well, they're on the labour ward, what's the difference? It's fundamental, and we've got to understand it. And all the time I'd like to relate this back to audit and looking at your results and the evidence. And then lastly, the whole idea about single cephalic versus obstetric abnormalities, the twins, the breaches, and the connection to efficient uterine action. So sure, if it comes in with a breach and it's efficient uterus and it's a MULTIP, the likelihood is that she will deliver normally within a few hours. And I agree very much so with some of the reflections of Professor Kirkham on how things have changed. But we've got to get back to the basics, I think, and this is what the basics, which continually overemphasised in the whole concept. In practice, it's just all these principles are just very simple principles. Very close attention to antenatal preparation. And there was a time when we were able to provide all our antenatal classes, or certainly first-time mothers' antenatal classes, in our own hospital. And indeed, the biggest room in the hospital is given over to antenatal preparation because it is so important, and that it must be clear to the mother that there's a connection between what we say in classes and what's actually going to happen, and the better that we do that. Nowadays there are some classes outside the hospital, but those who give classes do come in to acquaint themselves with guidelines and other, philosophy of care, which I think is important. Guidelines is such a popular term now. We need to use it, but obviously there's a difference in meaning to it. Now, early but correct diagnosis of labour and efficient uterine action, I probably should say something a little bit more about that. And we're talking really about the nulliparous woman, because that's where the diagnosis is important. And this is just a diagram to show the difference, and everybody knows this obviously, but it's just to illustrate the point really simply that when we diagnose somebody in labour, it's not early labour, latent labour or whatever, it's in labour or not in labour, and a decision is made, but it's related to the effacement of the cervix, where the cervix is thin and effaced. And I think if you put that on a partogram, or the template partogram, the Friedman's curve, just to illustrate over the latent phase, it's not the 1, 2 to 3 or whatever it is, it's where it's effaced, that's when they're started on the partogram, and that's when they're started in labour. Now, I'm sure there'll be different opinions about this. I'm trying to just give you a factual thing of how we do that. Now, and we're coming back to this group 1 as in the 10 groups, which some of you may have heard of, but spontaneously labouring nulliparous women with a single cephalic pregnancy at greater or equal to 37 weeks gestation. It is the most important group in any labour ward. If you want to find out about any labour ward and its outcome, this is the group to study in spontaneous labour. So I'm talking about this group in particular. And I want to be quite specific in what our